Sharing my time with the member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes, and I'd like to come back before I start to the discussion we were just having, because I know my two colleagues who just spoke were actually both gentlemen who supported the legalization of marijuana, of cannabis. It's just interesting the discussion we've had over the last few minutes actually about these administrative charges, because when I talk to prosecutors about past charges around simple possession, they will tell you that many times people come into court and are charged with multiple offenses, so maybe other drug offenses, trafficking, those kinds of things tied in, and it's often pled down to simple possession. And so it's interesting to see that in this situation, they will actually qualify for the Liberals' proposal across opposite, whereas somebody, a person who was in their teenage years when they were charged from a rural area, for example, who then does not have the capacity to get to a court hearing or who has failed to appear and gets this administrative charge, then will not qualify for that kind of hearing. So right off from the beginning, we see the unintended consequences of poor legislation. And certainly this isn't the only place that that's happened with this government, because I think it'll probably be known in the future as a government that brought legislation in without having thought through much of it, and we see bills come back with 25 or 30 or 40 amendments, you know that the government hasn't done their job preparing. And we've seen it all over the place. We've seen it in a million different places. I guess we're seeing it right at home right now in my area on the canola issue, which you would be familiar with. We found early on that the Chinese government wanted us to do something about tariffs on steel. Our government refused to do that because they were more interested in kowtowing to the Chinese government than dealing with our biggest trading partner, the United States, and because we wouldn't move on it, we end up with tariffs. Now we've got further tariffs on canola. We've got tariffs now on pork because this government doesn't consider what it's doing. It doesn't take into account the consequences of its activities, and then we see all kinds of secondary effects. And certainly this legislation, when I get around to talking about it, will indicate that as well. We see it on carbon taxes, Mr. Speaker, another tax that's imposed. It has the highest impact on Canadian people with the least effect of any type of carbon program that you could put in place. Where Aboriginal Affairs would be another good example. We just heard this afternoon about the fact that on this bill, another bill, they failed to consult the Aboriginal community. They haven't gone to them and asked them what's best for your people. They claim that the majority of people who are impacted by this are Aboriginal and those who are very low income, but they don't go to them and actually ask what would work for you. You don't have access often to urban centers. You don't have access to a lot of the easy access to the internet and those kinds of things. What would work for you? Instead, they come with a plan that for many people will not work. As well, in other Aboriginal affairs, they've divided communities. I guess energy projects in our part of the world would be a good example of many bands who want to participate. They want to be part of the prosperity that comes out of those energy projects, and this government has basically divided those communities, and that's kind of seems to be what they do most effectively. Another good example, they talked about consultations on this bill and the government failing to do that, would be around their firearms consultations meetings that they had in the last few months. They went into it, and I would say that they set the meetings up to make them work as well as possible for the government that they could, and it didn't quite turn out their way. They had 135,000 online responses, and basically it was 75%, 80% to 20% opposed to the government actually making a move and changing. And so I guess they didn't anticipate that, but that was the reality of the Canadian population. Once again, they misread them. And again, we see it unintended consequences around energy disasters, such as the purchase of the Trans Mountain pipeline. There was no need to be doing that. I actually think probably the place where the most obvious set of unintended consequences has been around financial management, because we've seen these folks come through and just blow through people's tax money. And I was interested last week when the Deputy House Leader was in here, we were talking about the budget implementation bill, and he was talking about the public purse. At every point he talked about the public purse, but rarely does he ever talk about taxpayers and the fact there's only one place that the government gets money, and that's out of the pockets of the taxpayers of Canada. So on each of these things, whether it's budgets that are running deficits 2 and 3 times what were promised, if it was, I mentioned the Trans Mountain pipeline, a pipeline that nobody wanted to sell and nobody wanted to buy. The proponent themselves were willing to spend the money on the project. Now we have taxpayers who dived into the tune of, so far, about $5 billion. If they're going to get the project done, it'll be another 10. And this government has committed that kind of money to it without even thinking about the taxpayers. We can see about the failure of their infrastructure funding to be spent fairly and equally. And then I think obviously another area where they've had unintended consequences, and probably one of the most obvious ones, was in their summer jobs program, where they completely misread Canadians, trying to force them to follow their ideology. Anybody who had a different perspective from this government was then pushed to the outside. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would argue that we're back here again. We have a late introduction of a bill, C-93. It looks more like a public relations project probably than anything else, where they've come in. And again, this follows on the footsteps of C-45 and C-46 bills that they passed without understanding many of the consequences of what they're doing. And I was not one of the people who supported those two bills. Again, the government they found themselves in a situation right now where they don't actually have capacity to meet the demand that's put in place. They didn't prepare for that. They don't have capacity to set a realistic price, and so those folks that are happily selling on the private market are doing just fine in spite of the government's attempt to try to stop that. And their messaging across the way has been that they're going to keep this out of the hands of people who shouldn't have it. Well, when I'm talking to junior high students, for example, they're telling me this is more accessible to them than it has ever been in their lives. And there's certainly no solution at the border either, Mr. Speaker. They heard them say earlier today, we've had discussions and this isn't going to be a problem for Canadians. Well, we know full well that it is. We have a small crossing near my home, and I went down a couple of weeks ago to Montana, to the post office down there, came back, and the U.S. customs agents are now stopping Canadians on the Canadian side, or on the U.S. side of the border, before we come up to Canada. So as you know, you stop at the U.S. side on the way down. When you come back, typically you just drove to the Canadian side and went out. They are now stopping everyone prior to them being allowed to exit to Canada. And I asked him, why are you doing this? And he said, well, we got the direction from right on high. And I said, when did it happen? He said, well, coincidentally, when you legalized cannabis. And so there's another problem here that these folks never thought of at all. I guess one of the things I want to talk about today, Mr. Speaker, is, as I'm wrapping up already, it seems like time flies very, very quickly here. We've talked a lot about the difference between pardons and expungement and those kinds of things, and this government has made its choice. There's others who have very different ideas. But one of the things that I want to bring up goes back to the taxpayers. There's a bill somewhere here between $0 and $600 million to do this process. And I guess I have a question as to why the taxpayers should be stuck with this bill one more time. This government seems comfortable with spending everyone else's money. We had a Liberal this morning talk about his friend who, when he graduated from university, couldn't get a job at 7-Eleven. But now he's a public servant and contributing very well. And I guess the question is, he's a public servant, he's probably doing really well. Why should the folks who are now working at 7-Eleven be expected to pay for his pardon or his expungement, whichever direction that the Liberal government finally goes with this legislation? And we've gotten so far away from considering where money comes from that this government just takes it out of the pockets of average people, doesn't think a thing about it. But you have a situation here where people have broken the law, and they broke it knowing what the law was typically, and knowing that if they got caught there was going to be a punishment. The law has now changed, and I don't have any problem with people getting pardons or expungement on those records. But the question is, why should the taxpayers, those folks who are working for an hourly wage, be expected then to pay that bill? And I suspect this is going to be much less successful than the Liberals have said it will be. I was surprised a little bit earlier. One of my NDP colleagues talked about the pardons that have been made available to the gay and lesbian community, and when he said that only 7 people so far have applied to the process. I understand that probably means the process is too complicated for people to be bothered with, and people just haven't done that. So we're talking about, today I've heard figures from 10,000 people will apply, that there's 100,000, there's 200, 400,000 that are impacted by this. But I guess my question to the government today would be, why do you expect that the taxpayers of Canada would once more pick up a bill or pick up the cost of a bill of yours that has come with a number of unintended consequences that weren't considered ahead of time?
Questions and comments. Question et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little bit confused with some of the closing remarks from the member opposite. I don't know if they now support or don't support. Do they pardon, expungement? It's really becoming more and more difficult. And I think what we're hearing is a lot of the personal opinions. And I think Canadians would be interested in the official position of the Conservative Party on what is an important piece of legislation. It's been an interesting process that dates back to the last federal election back in 2015, as you know, Mr. Speaker, where we have both the NDP who did not, underline the word not, support the legalization of cannabis, and the Conservative Party, who also did not support. Now the NDP support legalization and even not only legalization of cannabis, but everything else, from what I understand. And the Conservative Party are not going to retract the legislation, and I think that's a good thing. My question to the member opposite is related to just that. Over the last few years, we've been evolving this progressive social policy. It's been going relatively, many would argue, exceptionally well. Would the member not agree that when you look at C93 and C45 combined, that in fact we are on the right track? Even the opposition critic's personal opinions indicated that she was in favor of the pardon.
For Cypress Hills Grasslands.
I noticed, Mr. Speaker, that he didn't touch on the issue that I raised right at the end of my presentation here, which is the cost to Canadian taxpayers. And certainly he talks about progressive social policy. They'll spend Canadians' money until it's all gone. That's what they specialize in. It's not in progressive social policy that works. They specialize in taking money out of people's pockets, spending it, and then not being accountable for it. And it started with a trip to the Bahamas. It certainly has continued with massive spending, with deficits that they can't control, and with very little interest in accountability for that money as well. So this is just one more place where that kind of carelessness has shown up. They don't plan ahead of time. They don't think about the consequences. He mentioned C45. They were told that that bill would be taken to courts pretty much immediately in terms of the impaired driving components of that bill, and the people who said that were right. And we see that now where that's being challenged in multiple places across Canada because they didn't consider the charter in the application of that bill.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we just heard testimony, and so honourable members can be forgiven because it just happened a little while ago from the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, as we did from the Native Women's Association of Canada, neither of whom were consulted about this bill, which is kind of shocking and hypocritical of the government because those are in particular two of the groups of Canadians that have been identified historically and presently as being discriminated against, particularly on marijuana laws and particularly on when seeking a pardon. The Liberal system has set up very well for middle, high income folks who are white, folks in the suburbs, but not for folks that are overrepresented in our prisons and overrepresented in our justice system. My question for my friend is this, that Mr. Cudjoe, who's the representative of the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, said that from his community, this will be seen as a token gesture. And why? Because in the combination of a simple possession charge, plus any charge of administrative justice, so that's a failure to comply, a false identity presentation, what Liberals themselves have said are very, very low-level discriminate crimes. The combination of those two things will exempt them from this pardon process. They simply will not be able to get a pardon under the system. I ask Liberals consistently, if the whole target of the bill is to help people get back into the system, particularly those that are marginalized, racialized, low income, and that those people won't be able to qualify under the rules that the Liberals have set down on the bill, what is the point of this exercise and who is it actually going to serve?
Honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands in 45 seconds or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague's intervention here because when he asks, is it a token, I think it is. When you take a look at the timing of the bill, comes at the end of a long session with very little time to be able to get it implemented. You look at the lack of consultation. that's put in place with those very communities that today, we've heard all day today, are the concern of the Liberals. And when you see the content in the bill, you have to take those three things, put them together, and you say, they're not really serious about this. This is one more of those public affairs exercises that they want to do, try to make themselves look good in front of people without actually having done the work. And in regards to the consultations, they have lots of consultations, but it's typically with the people that they want to meet with, who say the things they want to hear. That's why so many of the other initiatives have gone badly, because when they find out what real Canadians think, they reject the leadership that this government has provided.